I think we have to consider that probability as fairly high at this point. That's why I said, quit, stop. That's the answer. The answer is to stop fighting immediately. Pick some third country somewhere to hold negotiations. I would stop supplying Ukraine. I mean, they've already lost between 1.5 and 1.8 million Ukrainian soldiers killed in action. Add to that another million plus that have been wounded. These are the real figures, not the phony figures that NATO publishes or we publish or Canada publishes. Forget it. Those are the real losses. The population of Ukraine is being cut by 50%. They've left the country or they've died or been killed. So you got what, 20 million, 21 million maybe left out of a nation of over 40 million at the beginning? This doesn't make sense. When this sort of thing happens, you stop. You recognize you can't go on or you're going to lose everything.
The headlines focus on missiles and military operations. But what if the real story is what happens after the fighting? Rising oil prices, fragile supply chains, mounting debt, and the risk of a much wider conflict could have consequences far beyond the battlefield. In this interview, retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor shares his perspective on where current events could be heading, why he believes the stakes are much higher than many realize, and what it could mean for the global economy. Let's hear his analysis.
Well, a friend of mine said it was kind of a moment of sobriety from an alcoholic that had decided to and I think that's what it turns out to be. I'm not sure any of it was ever really serious. If you go back to that memorandum of understanding, that was effectively an agreement that gave the Iranians virtually everything they wanted. I wouldn't call it a surrender document. I would simply say what they fought the war for is what they get. We, on the other hand, were not necessarily going to profit in any particular way. In other words, we saw no strategic gain from it. At least Donald Trump didn't. And, he's one of these people that keeps talking about you've got to open the strait, open the strait, open the strait. He fails to point out that the strait was open until we attacked Iran. So, let's get the strait open, Donald. I agree with you, and let's not worry so much about the rest of the stuff. But unfortunately, he's not a free agent. So let me give you some points that I think your listening audience will appreciate. Point number one is the Iranians do not trust Donald Trump. They have no confidence in anything he says, no confidence in the stability of his decisions. That's very important. Secondly, international investors. We're talking about people that are in the business of financing things like refineries, oil infrastructure, mining, and so forth. They have no confidence in Trump's ability to reestablish stability in the region. They see the Middle East as a place where they will not invest or, lend money until they're absolutely certain that there will be no more war. So when he talks about, well, we're going to have this agreement and it's going to be so good and we're going to win, and after we win, everything's going to be better, nobody believes that. So you're not going to see any oil or gas infrastructure rebuilt until, I would argue, the United States and Donald Trump are effectively marginalized or completely out of it. Trump represents instability right now. Investors and leaders believe Trump will ensure endless destruction from endless wars, and that means, if you're in finance and business, endless losses for financiers and investors. Now, the situation today is much worse than it was when he signed the Memorandum of Understanding. The continuation of the war as he's waging it right now, which is escalating, Daryl, is going to lead to oil price increases, something which he's been able to suppress by manipulating the markets and Wall Street. So I think in a couple of months, we're looking at $150 a barrel, and it could go much higher. This means that we're also looking at a massive global downturn, which the United States, given its incredible debt, may not recover from for 20 years. So I think those, from your standpoint, from people in Vancouver, from people in Canada who invest and want to know where is the market going to go and what's going to happen, what will or won't work. I think those are pretty grim points, but I think they're the truth.
Macgregor begins by arguing that today's conflict could extend far beyond one region. His concern isn't only about military action, but the wider economic consequences if instability continues. In his view, prolonged conflict could reshape investment, energy markets, and global growth in ways many people still underestimate.
He started the war and said, we've got to affect regime change. We got to get rid of this regime. We got to have to have a new government that will work with us. Okay, that failed. And people said, well, if that failed, what are you going to do? Well, we can't let Iran have a nuclear weapon. Okay, so what are you going to do? Well, we're going to bomb. Well, how's that gone? Well, that hasn't worked. Well, what are you going to do now? Well, I'm going to destroy Iran. Remember the statement, civilization gone in a night. I mean, only a complete lunatic.
It's like praise be to Allah and some other stuff.
Only a complete lunatic would make such a statement. And now where are we? Well, suddenly it's all about the Gulf. Got to reopen the Gulf, reopen the Gulf, reopen the Gulf. Okay, how's that going? Well, it's not going very well. You sign this MOU and you say they broke the MOU. In reality, they didn't do anything they said they wouldn't. They were going to control the Gulf and they were going to tell people where they had to move. We tried to circumvent that and move them through a different corridor. That provoked the Iranians. But I think the real goal was to get the war started again. Because the real goal at this point is to destroy Iran. Now, what do I mean by destroy? You want to so completely weaken the government, the central government, and the society that Iran breaks up into smaller fragments or pieces. This has always been the Western goal in Ukraine against Russia. You know, nobody cares about Ukraine. Ukrainians are people we just use like tissue on the battlefield. They're the cannon fodder. And we keep providing them with whatever we think that we can get them that creates the illusion they're still alive out there. And they managed to do some serious damage. They reduced the refining capacity, at least temporarily, by about 38% through some of their unmanned strikes. Hasn't changed the war, doesn't make any difference on the battlefield, but you know, it creates the illusion of something in the hopes that more people will throw money away on the war with Russia. So that war has failed. Well, the same goals are now in effect with Iran. So you had to get the war started. We found a way to do it. We blame them for breaking the MOU. You have to remember, in the United States, you have, I would say, at least 25 to 30% of the population is willing to believe anything you say that is bad about not just Iran, but Islam in general and Muslims in general. So that's helpful to the administration. But the people who are really behind all of this are people who support what we call the Israel lobby. And the most prominent members are these Zionist Jewish billionaires, some group of them, several of them, enormous quantities of money with which, over the years, they have been able to purchase the United States government for use. Now, what about the rest of the population that doesn't fall into that almost 30% that I mentioned? Well, they don't want anything to do with the war in the Gulf. They're opposed to it. And I think if you look at the polling data, that comes through. The last time I looked, it was something like 73% of Americans questioned said we should be out of the Gulf. Well, more than that opposed World War I. Didn't make any difference. We were still dragged into the war. Right now, simply because most Americans don't think we should be involved in the Gulf, doesn't make any difference. Why not? Because the people paying for everything are the billionaires that support the Israel lobby. And the Israel lobby wants one thing: the destruction, dismemberment of Iran. Because they're in the business of establishing the supremacy and hegemony of the Jewish state over everyone and everything in the region. They are linked to enormously powerful financial interests that want to take over the resources, just as they wanted to take over the resources that are now sitting under Russian control in eastern Ukraine. They want to take over the resources, the oil fields and so forth, that Iran possesses. They've effectively humbled the Arabs and beaten them down to the point where the Arabs will do almost anything they tell them to do. So the last man standing in the region at the moment is Iran. and Iran will not submit to Israeli demands. Now, there's another major player that could be just as challenging, if not even more so, than Iran, and that's the Turks, or Turkey. The Turks are an immensely powerful state, but their leader has chosen to straddle the fence in an effort to benefit in terms of territorial expansion and financial strength from all sides. How long will that go on is anybody's guess. I suspect at some point that will end and they will turn on the Israelis. But right now, Iran is staying the course. It's maintaining its sovereignty, its independence against us and Israel. And we are really muscle for the Israeli program. You remember all these mafia movies? They'd say, well, come on, Tony, we know you're not really muscle. You're not one of the muscle guys, so talk to us, okay? We're the muscle. The question is, how long can we do this? Well, we've got two big problems. I talked about one of them at the beginning here, the financial issue. We've printed about all the money we can. If you look at our bond market, our 10-year, which is usually seen as the bellwether of serious crises, is at about 4.5, 4.6%. Most experts in the bond markets say that if we hit 5% in the 10-year bond, our entire financial structure will collapse. So that's one constraint. Second constraint, we only have so many missiles, and we're running out. And we can't manufacture them fast enough to keep up with the demand for the war. The Iranians, on the other hand, they've put everything into manufacturing, they've put it underground, and they can turn out missiles and unmanned systems at a much higher rate, much greater speed than we can. And behind them stand preeminently China and Russia. China is heavily invested in Iran. It buys most of Iran's oil. In addition to that, though, Iran is a key player in the Chinese Belt and Road. This is the structure of transportation and commerce the Chinese and the Russians have collaborated on across Central Asia so that you would be able to effectively move goods from Shanghai overland all the way to Rochefort on the west coast of France, and then from there to the United States or anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere, and do it very quickly and less expensively. So they're invested there, but they also see something else. Remember, we have imprudently threatened the Chinese on numerous occasions, especially about Taiwan. And the Chinese are not interested in that. We have the Shanghai Communique, which we signed in 1973, that said Taiwan is part of China. End of story. And everybody's accepted that until we got to Joe Biden and now Donald Trump. So the Chinese are saying, well, there's no interest on our part or incentive on our part to try and broker a quote-unquote deal with the United States if that means the United States turns around and tries to attack us. And the good news to the Chinese that all of the technology that they would rely on in a war against us is performing brilliantly against us in Iran. So you put all of this together, it's a pretty grim picture right now. We're not going to win anything. And I think asking that question right up front is key. Well, what the hell are we winning? And nobody can really tell you that. Well, we're making Israel great again. I mean, that's some people will laugh and say that,
The discussion now shifts from military objectives to the financial side of the conflict. Macgregor links energy prices, debt, supply chains, and global markets, arguing that the economic consequences could ultimately become just as significant as the geopolitical ones.
I understand completely, and I think that particular picture that you've shown everybody is a very good one. We need to understand that when the American government embarked on discussions with the Iranians under President Obama, the goal was to find a way out of this one-way street to nuclear weapons. The Iranians were receptive because the Iranians concluded it made more sense for them to become and remain a nuclear threshold state than it did to become a nuclear armed state. In other words, we're going to enrich uranium to a certain level, 20%, 30%, 40%, whatever. And this is going to be for industrial, internal, and medical use only. And they always knew, and we knew, that they would still be able, in in an emergency or a crisis, to enrich it to 90+% to create plutonium. Plutonium being the critical component of a nuclear weapon. That's enriched uranium, highly enriched uranium. We call it plutonium. But we said, fine, that works for us. We set up a system that allowed international monitoring so that if the Iranians decided that they were going to press ahead and start ramping up, we would know about it. And the Iranians basically said to the Trump administration, who walked away from this, well, if you're walking away from the agreement, we have no choice but to enrich uranium to a point where if we have to, we could conceivably build a weapon. However, the supreme leader at the time, whom we recently assassinated, along with his whole family, had stated that it was fundamentally immoral and illegal for Iran to have nuclear weapons. And the Iranian state followed that prohibition. He is gone. His family was killed. His son has succeeded him, I guess. And there is now talk inside Iran of potentially building a nuclear weapon. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, I think it has something to do with the relentless, unending attacks of Israeli and American armed forces on Iran. Because the lesson historically that was learned back in 1991 was if you don't want to end up like Saddam Hussein, you really need a nuclear weapon to deter the Americans from attacking you. We didn't face a nuclear threat in Iraq, so we could use our high-end conventional dominance. Well, if you have a nuclear weapon, suddenly your high-end conventional dominance is no longer a guarantee of victory because you could suddenly lose great quantities of people and equipment to a nuclear strike. I can't predict the future. I'm not Nostradamus. But I think in retrospect, we can say, first of all, it was a very serious mistake to end that agreement. That agreement may not have been perfect, but worked. The problem is it was always an Israeli talking point. The lobby opposed it. The lobby didn't want an agreement because the lobby wants the destruction of the regime and ultimately now the society and the state. That's as far as the Israelis are concerned and their Jewish billionaire backers in the United States. Israel cannot exist in the region if there is a powerful nuclear-armed Iran.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So could this end in like a nuclear disaster? Do you think Trump has the, I guess, cojones to like nuke Iran or something like that? Could this get as bad as that?
Well, as irrational and emotional as he often is, I do think he understands that the use of a nuclear weapon would be catastrophic for the world. Now, why is that? Because if he or the Israelis or the Iranians or anybody else used a nuclear weapon, that would end the widely accepted, almost universal consensus that nuclear weapons are off the table for anything other than defense of national territory. That's very important because that was what the Soviets agreed to. That's what we agreed to in fundamental terms. We will not use a nuclear weapon against each other. We will confine our use of a nuclear weapon if it becomes necessary to the defense of our homeland. That's all. If we were to use one over there against Iran, we're no longer defending our homeland. Of course, we're not defending our homeland as it is, but we're now legitimating the use of a nuclear weapon for purposes other than homeland defense. So I don't think President Trump will do that. I hope I'm right, but all things are possible. I worry much more about the Israelis because they have various programs, one of which is called the Samson option, that effectively say if we think someone else in the region has a nuclear weapon or we could be nuked, then we will preempt and we will nuke them. I hope not, because I think that would spell the end for Israel. Israel is a very small state. If they were to use such a weapon and there was a nuclear response, which I think they could almost certainly reckon with, that would be the end of Israel. Now, would the Iranians use a nuclear weapon if they have it? I don't know. I don't think so. I have heard rumors on the internet that the decision makers in Tehran are discussing the use of a nuclear device as a demonstration. Somewhere down in the open deserts of southern Iran, a small nuclear detonation just to demonstrate to everyone we have it, on the assumption that that'll scare everyone off. And my argument against that was very simple. If you do that, you make it inevitable that the Israelis will strike you. Because they'll say, see, there's a nuclear weapon. To survive, we have to strike Iran. That would be catastrophic. And I don't see how such an action would not result in the inevitable intervention into the larger war by Russia and China, and potentially others. Clearly, the Turks would then rapidly gain access to a weapon from Pakistan, no doubt in my mind. Then Israel would have a nuclear-armed Turkey right on its border.
Mm-hmm.
So, my advice, and it's been from the beginning, Daryl, President Trump, quit. Stop. Yeah. There is no good military solution to this problem. Don't waste any more time. We don't live in the region. We just don't live there. We have demonstrated that we cannot protect the partners that we have in the region. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. We can't. And that's what the Iranians have demonstrated to their friends on the west side of the Persian Gulf. You've sponsored these bases. You've threatened us. Welcome to the party. If you do this in the future, we will annihilate you. So there's not much we can do about that. And I think what we need to do, and this is something that all great